Welcome back to D.R.S. Hakim's Wealth Lessons. These inspiring, transformative lessons are designed to help you transform your behavior, strengthen your attitude, develop greater discipline, and cultivate the qualities necessary to earn, manage, multiply, and preserve lasting wealth. Today's lesson is titled, The Value of Adaptability. Adjust your strategy without abandoning your goal. In our previous lesson, Persistence equals success, keep moving when progress becomes difficult, Professor Hakim taught us the importance of continuing purposeful effort when progress becomes challenging and learning from the difficulties we encounter, rather than simply giving up. Today, Professor Hakim takes us to the next step, learning when and how to adjust without unnecessarily abandoning what we are working to accomplish. Before we give the floor to Professor Hakim, here are today's questions. Caleb from Charlotte, North Carolina, United States asks, Professor Hakim, how can I tell the difference between being adaptable and constantly changing my plans because I am impatient? Samira from Muscat, Oman asks, D.R.S. Hakim, what should I do when I have invested years into a particular career or business direction, but I begin to realize that I may need to change? And Mateo from Cordoba, Argentina asks, Professor Hakim, how can a business owner adapt to changing conditions without losing the original identity of the business? Thank you, Caleb, Samira, and Mateo. Professor Hakim will answer your questions at the conclusion of today's lesson, so be sure to stay with us until the end. And now, please join me in welcoming D.R.S. Hakim.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, viewers, for investing your time in continuing this journey with us through the Behavioral Wealth Dynamics series. Today, I am sitting outdoors at Frank Lloyd Wright's remarkable Falling Water in Pennsylvania, USA, with the house, the surrounding landscape, and the waterfalls clearly visible behind me. As I sit here listening to the continuous movement of the water, I am reminded of something that connects beautifully with today's lesson. Falling water is remarkable not because its architecture attempts to overpower its surroundings, but because the structure was designed in relationship with them. The architecture responds to the landscape, incorporates the existing rock formations, extends above the flowing water, and demonstrates what can happen when design responds intelligently to existing conditions. Now consider the water itself. It continues moving, but it does not insist upon traveling through every obstacle in precisely the same manner. It moves across changing elevations, around rock formations, over ledges, and through available openings. Its course adjusts while its movement continues. That is an excellent representation of adaptability. When circumstances change, intelligent people do not necessarily abandon the destination. They determine whether the route must change. This brings us directly to today's lesson, the value of adaptability. Adjust your strategy without abandoning your goal. In our previous lesson, persistence equals success. Keep moving when progress becomes difficult. We examined the importance of continuing purposeful effort when advancement becomes difficult. But persistence naturally raises another question. What happens when you should continue toward the objective, but you should no longer continue in exactly the same way? That is where persistence must be joined by adaptability. I want my students to understand this distinction clearly. Persistence asks whether you are willing to continue. Adaptability asks whether you are intelligent enough to change how you continue when credible evidence requires it. Persistence without adaptability can lead to rigidity. Persistence without adaptability can deteriorate into rigidity, while adaptability without persistence can deteriorate into inconsistency. When the two work together, however, you can remain committed to a worthwhile objective without becoming imprisoned by an ineffective method. Adaptability does not mean changing your plans and strategies every time you become uncomfortable. It does not mean pursuing one business opportunity on Monday, abandoning it on Wednesday, and beginning something entirely different by Friday. That is not disciplined adaptability. It may be impatience, emotional reactivity, or a lack of commitment. Adaptability is the disciplined ability to recognize meaningful changes in circumstances, information, or results, and then make an appropriate adjustment without unnecessarily surrendering the larger objective. The important words are disciplined, meaningful, and appropriate. Not every inconvenience deserves a change. Not every criticism deserves a response. Not every new trend deserves your attention. But when reliable evidence repeatedly demonstrates that your method is no longer producing the intended result, you must possess enough humility and flexibility to examine what needs to change. There are individuals who become so attached to their original plan that they interpret changing it as admitting defeat. I respectfully disagree. If credible evidence demonstrates that a particular method is no longer effective, refusing to adjust simply because you want to prove that your original decision was correct is not a strength. It may be pride disguised as commitment. The purpose of your strategy is to help you advance toward the objective. The objective does not exist merely to justify the strategy. This is precisely why I teach my students to distinguish between the destination and the route. Imagine traveling toward an important destination and discovering that the road ahead has been closed. Would you park your vehicle in front of the barrier indefinitely because that was the road you originally intended to use? Of course not. You would examine another route. You might turn left instead of right. You might travel farther. You might arrive later than expected. But if the destination remains worthwhile, changing the route does not mean abandoning the destination. The same principle applies to wealth creation, entrepreneurship, education, professional development, and financial behavior. Sometimes your objective remains correct while your strategy requires modification. One of the most important skills you can develop is the ability to distinguish adaptability from impatience. Impatience says, this is not happening quickly enough, so I am going to do something different. Adaptability asks, what does the evidence demonstrate, and does that evidence justify changing my approach? Suppose someone begins a legitimate marketing strategy for a business. The strategy realistically requires several months before enough information can be gathered to evaluate its effectiveness. After 2 weeks, however, the owner becomes frustrated because sales have not dramatically increased. The strategy is abandoned and replaced. 2 weeks later, the second strategy is abandoned. Then comes a third, followed by a fourth. The business owner may feel extremely active, but activity is not necessarily advancement. I teach my students that movement without direction can consume enormous energy while producing very little progress. Adaptability requires enough patience to gather meaningful evidence before making unnecessary changes. Before changing a strategy, ask yourself, what result was I expecting? Was my expectation realistic? How long does it take to make a reasonable evaluation? What measurements am I using? What specifically is not working? Has something meaningful changed in the environment? Or am I simply uncomfortable because the result has not arrived as quickly as I wanted? These questions help move adaptability away from emotional reaction and toward disciplined evaluation. Before we proceed further, I want to briefly reconnect today's discussion with several neurological concepts we have examined throughout our Behavioral Wealth Dynamics series. I emphasize briefly because my purpose today is not to reteach the neuroscience. My purpose is to show how these concepts can help us think about adaptability. We have discussed the D.R.S, or reticular activating system, in connection with arousal and the regulation of attention. In practical terms, for our discussion, our brains are continually confronted with far more sensory information than we can consciously examine in equal detail. Systems involved in attention help determine what receives greater priority. When you are pursuing an objective, what you repeatedly focus upon can influence what information you notice and consider relevant. For adaptability, this reminds us that we must remain attentive not only to information confirming our expectations, but also to credible information indicating that conditions may have changed. We have also discussed the prefrontal cortex, which participates in executive functions such as planning, evaluating alternatives, inhibiting inappropriate responses, and goal-directed behavior. Adaptability requires more than noticing change. It requires evaluating what that change means and deciding whether a behavioral adjustment is justified. The ACC, or anterior cingulate cortex, which we revisited in our previous lesson, participates within broader neural networks involved in monitoring conflict, errors, efforts, and discrepancies. For today's purpose, think about the importance of recognizing the gap between what you expected to happen and what is actually happening. That discrepancy can provide valuable information. And most recently, we introduced the PCC, or posterior cingulate cortex, an important component of the default mode network associated with internally directed and self-referential processing, among other functions. This becomes relevant because changing a strategy can become psychologically difficult when we attach that strategy to our identity. Instead of saying the strategy needs to change, we may begin thinking, if I change, that means I was wrong. If I was wrong, what does that say about me? That is precisely where we must be careful. The RES prefrontal cortex, ACC, and posterior cingulate cortex do not operate as isolated switches for adaptability. Human behavior emerges from complex interactions among many neural systems. But taken together as concepts we have studied throughout this series, they remind us of something valuable. We must notice relevant information, evaluate it, recognize discrepancies, reflect upon what those experiences mean, and then adjust our behavior when credible evidence requires it. One of the greatest mistakes people make when confronting change is failing to distinguish principles from procedures. Principles establish standards. Procedures establish methods. Your principles may include honesty, excellence, responsibility, disciplined financial management, keeping your word, treating customers appropriately, and producing genuine value. Those principles should not be casually abandoned merely because circumstances change. Procedures are different. Procedures concern how the work is performed. Technology can change. Distribution can change. Marketing can change. Communication can change. Pricing structures can change. Customer expectations can change. The tools used in your profession can change. The method by which customers discover and purchase your products can change. I teach my students to ask two questions. What must I preserve, and what am I permitted to change? That distinction protects you from two opposite mistakes. The first is abandoning valuable principles simply because something new has appeared. The second is protecting outdated procedures as though they were sacred principles. Consider a man who assumes responsibility for a family manufacturing company that has operated successfully for several decades. The company produces high-quality custom components for commercial clients. His father built the business through personal relationships, telephone orders, printed catalogs, experienced sales representatives, excellent craftsmanship, and a reputation for keeping commitments. The son respects what his father created. He has no desire to discard the company's history. He understands that customers have trusted the company for decades because of its quality and reliability. However, as he assumes greater responsibility, he begins noticing changes in the marketplace. Long-standing customers are aging, and younger purchasing managers behave differently. They search for suppliers online before making phone calls. They expect technical specifications to be immediately accessible. They want digital quotations, electronic communication, faster turnaround, and the ability to submit design files without relying upon outdated procedures. Meanwhile, newer competitors are investing in digital systems. Some produce components of comparable quality, while others do not. But they have made themselves easier to discover, easier to contact, and easier to purchase from. The family company still produces excellent work, yet potential customers who do not already know the company may never discover what it can provide. Several long-standing employees resist modernization. They say, "We have been doing business this way for 30 years." That statement deserves careful examination. The fact that something worked for 30 years demonstrates that it produced value historically. It does not automatically demonstrate that every procedure remains optimal today. The new owner, therefore, asks an important question: what actually made this company successful? Was it the printed catalog? Was it the telephone? Was it the paper order form? No, those were methods. The deeper qualities were craftsmanship, reliability, customer relationships, quality, expertise, and keeping commitments. Those are the principles he must preserve. Once he understands the distinction, he begins modernizing the company without destroying its identity. He develops a professional digital presence containing detailed product specifications. Customers can securely submit technical drafts and request quotations electronically. He implements a customer management system so inquiries can be tracked rather than remaining scattered across individual emails, notebooks, and phone messages. But notice what he does not do. He does not eliminate experienced employees simply because technology is available. Their knowledge remains valuable. Instead, he gives them improved tools. Their expertise is preserved, while inefficient procedures are improved. He also begins examining the company's financial information more carefully. Some products generate healthy margins and repeat business. Others consume excessive production capacity while contributing relatively little profit. Instead of continuing every product line merely because we have always made it, he uses evidence to determine where resources can be allocated more intelligently. Over time, the company becomes easier to discover, communicate with, and purchase from. Yet customers still recognize the qualities that made the company valuable in the first place. Did this entrepreneur abandon his father's company? No. He preserved the principles while adapting the procedures. That is the value of adaptability. One of the greatest barriers to adaptability is pride. Human beings can become emotionally invested in being correct. Once we publicly announce a plan, defend a strategy, invest money, and tell other people what we intend to accomplish, changing direction may feel embarrassing. We begin worrying about what other people will say. They said this strategy would succeed. He told everyone this was the right decision. He invested years developing that approach. Now, the evidence suggests that something should change. What should the individual protect, the objective or the prideful appearance of always being right? I respectfully disagree with the idea that changing your position after receiving better evidence demonstrates weakness. The willingness to correct yourself when credible information changes is evidence that learning has occurred and wisdom has been acquired. Suppose you made a responsible decision using the best information available at the time. 6 months later, you possess important information that was not previously available. Why should you pretend that the new information does not exist simply to defend the old decision? Your responsibility is not to remain loyal to outdated or obsolete information. Your responsibility is to make the best decision you can with the information currently available to you. That requires humility. Adaptability is equally important in financial development. The financial strategy appropriate for you at one stage may not remain appropriate forever. Income can change. Responsibilities can change. Business conditions can change. Knowledge can increase. Opportunities can change. Goals can develop. Therefore, responsible financial behavior requires periodic evaluation. But I want to emphasize something. Adaptability does not mean constantly changing your plans and strategies in response to every headline, rumor, prediction, or social media personality. That is not the adaptability I am teaching. That can become reactive behavior. Ask, what changed? Why does that change matter? What evidence supports my conclusion? What are the consequences of adjusting? What are the consequences of doing nothing? Those questions force you to evaluate rather than merely react. Within the framework I describe as Triadic Alignment, adaptability can also be examined through the alignment of the cranial brain, heart brain, and gut brain. The cranial brain contributes to analysis, learning, planning, and evaluation. The heart brain concerns values and deeper commitments. The gut brain contributes to the visceral dimension of our responses, particularly when uncertainty and change create discomfort. Suppose the evidence clearly demonstrates that a business strategy needs modification. Your cranial brain may recognize the numbers, but you may remain deeply attached to the original strategy because you invested years developing it. At the same time, the uncertainty associated with change may produce a powerful visceral reaction. Triadic alignment does not mean ignoring any of these dimensions. It means examining them together. What does the evidence demonstrate? What values must be preserved? What am I experiencing internally? And is that response helping me recognize a legitimate concern or merely making me afraid to change? The objective is alignment, not impulse. Adaptability can be obstructed by what I describe as negative acidic toxins, or NATs. In today's context, NATs can appear through thoughts such as, I have always done it this way. Changing means I failed, I'm too old to learn anything new. If the original strategy does not work, everything is ruined. Or people will think less of me if I change direction. These patterns of thinking can trap individuals inside behavior that no longer serves the objective. We replace NATs with positive essential nutrients, or PENs: curiosity, humility, courage, flexibility, disciplined observation, patience, willingness to learn, and responsible experimentation. Instead of saying, I have always done it this way, ask, is this still the most effective way? What have I learned that I did not know when I made the original decision? Instead of saying everything is ruined, ask what remains valuable and what specifically requires adjustment. I want to give my students and everyone watching something practical that can be applied immediately. I call it the adaptability audit. Keep, change, and test. First, keep. Identify what is working. What principles, behaviors, relationships, systems, or strategies continue producing genuine value? Do not change something simply because it is old. Age does not automatically make a method ineffective any more than novelty automatically makes a method superior. If something remains effective, ethical, appropriate, and aligned with your objective, typically it should be preserved. Second, change. Identify what credible evidence indicates the operation is no longer producing the desired results. What has become inefficient? What circumstances have changed? Where are costs increasing unnecessarily? What customer feedback continuously appear? Where do you repeatedly encounter the same preventable problem? Third, test. You do not always need to make an enormous change immediately. Sometimes, the most responsible approach is to test an adjustment on a smaller scale. Pilot a new system within one department. Introduce a new service to a limited group of customers. Measure what happens before expanding the change. Keep what works. Change what evidence demonstrates should change. Test what you are not yet certain about. Now, I want you to reflect carefully upon your own behavior. Ask yourself, am I continuing a particular method because it remains effective or merely because it is familiar? When evidence challenges my strategy, do I investigate the evidence or immediately become defensive? Have I confused changing my method with abandoning my objective? Is there an area of my financial, professional, social, or spiritual behavior where circumstances have changed but my behavior has not? Do I change direction too frequently because I am impatient? Or do I resist necessary change because I am afraid? And finally, when I refuse to adjust, am I protecting the objective or am I protecting my ego? Do not rush through those questions. Your answers may reveal where adaptability is currently required. For this lesson, I want you to practice these affirmations. I remain committed to worthwhile objectives while adapting intelligently to new information. I have the discipline to preserve what works and the courage to change what does not. I evaluate credible evidence before changing direction. I do not allow my ego or fear to prevent necessary growth. I continually learn, adjust, and advance with wisdom and discipline. Remember that affirmations are not substitutes for behavior. Their purpose is to reinforce behavioral standards you intend to practice. Your assignment this week is to complete your own adaptability audit. Choose one important financial, professional, educational, or entrepreneurial objective and create 3 categories: keep, change, and test. Identify at least one element you should keep because it continues to produce value. Identify one element credible evidence suggests should change, then identify one adjustment you can test on a limited scale without unnecessarily disrupting everything else. After you conduct a test, examine the results. Do not merely ask, did I like the change? Ask, what did the evidence demonstrate? Then allow the evidence to educate your next decision. Now let us turn our attention to the question Sarah introduced earlier. Caleb from Charlotte, North Carolina, United States inquires, Professor Hakim, how can I tell the difference between being adaptable and constantly changing my plans because I am impatient? Thank you, Caleb, for this important question. The distinction is found primarily in why you are changing and what evidence supports the change. Adaptability responds to meaningful information, Impatience frequently responds to discomfort. If a strategy realistically requires 6 months to evaluate and you abandon it after 2 weeks merely because you have not received immediate results, you have not necessarily adapted. You may simply have become impatient. Before beginning a strategy, establish reasonable measurements. Determine what you expect to happen within a certain period and what evidence would indicate that the strategy is succeeding, underperforming, or failing. Then evaluate according to those standards rather than according to your mood on a particular day. This is why I teach my students that you should never confuse constant movement with advancement. A person can change direction repeatedly and remain in approximately the same place. Adaptability is not demonstrated by how frequently you change. It is demonstrated by the intelligence of the adjustment. Do not change merely because you are uncomfortable. Change because disciplined evaluation demonstrates that a better approach is justified. Samira from Muscat, Oman questions, D.R.S. Hakim, what should I do when I have invested years into a particular career or business direction, but I begin to realize that I may need to change? Thank you, Samira, for this inspiring question. First, understand that changing direction does not automatically erase the value of the years that came before it. Experience can produce transferable assets, knowledge, discipline, relationships, communication skills, judgment, leadership, negotiation abilities, problem-solving abilities, and an understanding of how organizations function. Those assets can travel with you even when the direction changes. The dangerous question is, how can I leave after everything I have already invested? A better question is, given everything I have learned and everything I know today, what is the most responsible direction from this point forward? Money already spent, years already invested, and effort already given cannot be recovered merely by continuing something that no longer makes sense. At the same time, do not abandon a worthwhile direction merely because it has become difficult. Examine the evidence carefully. Within triadic alignment, you can also ask whether your cranial brain's evaluation of the evidence, the values represented within the heart-brain dimension of the framework, and the visceral responses associated with the gut-brain dimension are working in alignment or pulling you in conflicting directions. Sometimes, what appears to be a strategic problem is actually fear of uncertainty. At other times, what appears to be courage is merely an unwillingness to admit that evidence has changed. The purpose of disciplined evaluation is to distinguish between them. Samira, do not disrespect your past by allowing yourself to become imprisoned by it. Allow what you learned yesterday to improve what you decide today. Mateo from Cordova, Argentina writes, Professor Hakim, how can a business owner adapt to changing conditions without losing the original identity of the business? Thank you, Mateo, for this wonderful question. Return to our distinction between principles and procedures. Identify what genuinely constitutes the identity of the company. Is it craftsmanship, reliability, trust, customer service, innovation, a particular heritage, exceptional quality? Those foundational qualities can be protected even while the procedures used to deliver them evolve. A manufacturer can preserve craftsmanship while adopting better technology. An educational company can preserve instructional quality while changing how its programs are delivered. A professional firm can preserve personal service while introducing more efficient communication systems. Ask, what do my customers value about us that should never be casually sacrificed? Then ask, which procedures exist merely because this is how we have historically done things? Do not confuse the container with what the container holds. Adaptability should not erase identity. Properly managed, adaptability can help preserve identity by ensuring that the organization remains capable of delivering its value in a changing environment. As we conclude today's lesson, remember, do not abandon a worthwhile destination merely because the route needs to change. We learn from the practice of strategic persistence to continue when progress becomes difficult. The practice of focused adaptability teaches us how to continue when circumstances, information, or evidence demonstrate that our method requires adjustment. Preserve what is valuable. Examine what is outdated. Test what is uncertain. Then have the discipline to act upon what you learn. I also strongly encourage my students and every viewer around the world to revisit these behavioral wealth dynamics lessons at least once every 3 days. Do not assume that because you heard a principle once, you have mastered it. Return to these lessons, listen again, reflect again, examine your behavior again. Most importantly, apply what you are learning. Repeat on without application may produce familiarity. But repetition combined with disciplined application can help reinforce meaningful behavioral change. And I want to emphasize that point. Do not merely listen to these lessons, apply them. Take the principles from these wealth lessons into your business decisions, your financial behavior, your professional development, your daily discipline, and the standards by which you conduct your life. Information becomes considerably more valuable when it influences what you actually do. For those who would like to experience a more profound and faster transformation, I strongly encourage you to secure a copy of my wealth-empowering transformational manuscripts, starting with Retrain Your Brain and Heart for Financial Success, followed by Become Wealthy Using Dynamic Imagination, The Universal Equation of Success, Gratitude plus Appreciation equals Wealth, and The Art and Science of Capturing Wealth, From Creation to Preservation. To exercise your appreciation for this lesson, we humbly ask you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, comment, and share this lesson with your family members, friends, colleagues, and loved ones. Someone else may be holding on to an ineffective approach because they mistakenly believe that changing direction means giving up. And if you have a question you would like answered, please send it to the email address provided in the description below or leave it in the comments section. Never assume that your question is too simple or too specific. Someone else may be struggling with precisely the same issue. Your question can benefit many others globally. Remember what I teach my students: remain committed enough to continue, humble enough to learn, intelligent enough to adjust, disciplined enough to act, and generous enough to share. Until next time, live long, maintain high standards, perform the best deeds, and continue to prosper.
Thank you for watching. We hope today's lesson has encouraged you to apply these timeless wealth-building principles in your own life. To gain a broader understanding of the principles we've discussed throughout this series, we encourage you to invest in your future transformation by securing a copy of each of D.R.S. Hakim's wealth-empowering and transformative manuscripts. Visit our online bookstore at retrainyourbrainforsuccess.com. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell for upcoming videos, comment and share. There is much more to discover, and we look forward to seeing you in our next exciting wealth lesson. And remember, as D.R.S. Hakim has often stated, procrastination is the enemy of success.